Good morning, vinyl community, crime community. I'm going to read out a chapter of Nick Schreck's book, In the Library of Lies, a literary autopsy. The truth is in your history books are full of bullshit. Most of your books are full of bullshit. You know that, being a writer yourself. Manson. Other quickie true crime paperbacks were rushed into print to capitalize on the case, but none of them had the wide distribution or long-lasting influence which Schiller's scam could claim. The following overview is not exhaustive. I've concerned on the worst, a long list, and the best, a very short list, and mostly skipped the mediocre. Just as it took two authors to hack together the killing of Sharon Tate, the team of Jerry LeBlanc, and Ivor Davis, IVOR Davis, collaborated on producing Five to Die, released by Holloway House, a specialist in sensational pulp literature. Needless to say, Five to Die's lurid promise to tell the true story of the satanic Charles Manson cult was not fulfilled. While the killing of Sharon Tate made a few passing references to Charlie's supposed satanic nature, Five to Die was the first volume to truly evoke the occult devil part of the Manson myth, and the press was already making so much of. Just as the comedy team of Lawrence Schiller, Cohen, and Torgenson distilled the killing of Sharon Tate from Susan Atkins' exhibitionist lies, sensation control mongers, LeBlanc and Davis, that's Ivar, based their potboiler on interviews with equally unreliable sources. According to Little Paul Watkins, who worked so closely with Bugliosi to push the helter-skelter motive around the middle of November, at approximately the same time Sadie was at the Sybil Brand Penitentiary for Women telling her story to Ronnie Howard, Juan Brooks Crockett, and I met with reporters Don Durham, Ivor Davis, and Jerry LeBlanc in Sherman Oaks, and told them that what we knew about the Manson family, including the murder of Gary Hinman and what we heard regarding Shorty Shea's death. The interview lasted 5 days and resulted in the publication of articles in both Spain and Germany, as well as a book which we did not agree to. Let's read that again. A book made in both Spain and Germany, and we did not agree to it. It was later released called Five to Die. We were paid $1,100 each for our information. Both books served to place the fantastic fiction of the sensational Manson myth in the public's gullible head before the trial could commence. While the Schiller quickly was deliberately conceived to spread the false scenario through the newspapers to fulfill a specific agenda, instant book Five to Die appears to have been inspired by nothing more than the usual mercantile motive of such hastily crafted literary crimes. Nonetheless, almost 6 months before the Manson and his co-defendants were put on trial, Five to Die was equally guilty of furthering all the nonsense about the satanic Svengali mind-controlling a cult called the Family that the public still eagerly laps up to this day. When Davis reprinted the book Ivor Davis in time for the 40th anniversary of the crimes, he peddled it as the book that helped convict Manson. There's probably some truth in that grandiose claim, as the first real book on the hot subject the public was eager to read about. Five to Die did help soft public opinion up to accept Bugliosi's more polished bullshit. Promoting a recent lecture, Davis went further, claiming that the district attorney, Aaron Stovitz, relied on Five to Die as a blueprint for the prosecution. Davis set the tone for all Manson reporting to come. It didn't matter if it had any bearing on the sordid truth, so long as it appealed to the prurient demand for hippie horror stories. Before he misreported Manson mania, Davis had a ticket to ride on the Beatles. Here we go, vinyl community. 1964 invasion of America as a foreign correspondent. He worked as George Harrison's ghostwriter, attending synagogue with Beatles manager Brian Epstein and witness Naughty John Lennon's penchant for performing Nazi salutes. Davis was also on hand for Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 assassination as the ambassador hotel in Los Angeles. He's starting to sound like Lawrence Schiller. Hot on the cloven hoofs, heels of the even worse Satan's Slaves. That's a book, not the biker club, which hit British bookstores as soon as January 1970. This was the United Kingdom's first book study of the brand new Manson phenomenon. It focused on completely imaginary society, secret society, skullduggery, and satanic ritual, setting the tone for the British take on Manson for many years to come. And even more than the United States, the false idea of Manson as devil worshiper, commanding blood sacrifices, caught on English pop culture. The influence of the Satan's Slaves book can be seen in Manson-inspired music from several credulous occultists and industrial bands well into the 70s and 80s. The fact that this insane paperback later became a high-priced collector's item, eagerly sought by true crime and occult hobbyists, lent its allure is hardly it deserves. Just as the Killing of Sharon Tate book was presented as the work of Lawrence Schiller, although it was really written by the uncredited LA Times, Cohen and Torgerson. Satan's Slaves was credited by James Taylor, a nom de plume for James Moffat, otherwise aka James Moffat, a prolific Canadian hack living in England. Moffat churned out hundreds of pulp paperbacks. Satan's Slave shows every sign of having been written at breakneck speed by cutting and pasting a handful of already inaccurate Manson-related shock horror items called from the British tabloid press. Moffat paddled his product into something vaguely resembling a coherent narrative by making it even more trite fantasies of hippie sex orgies and diabolical doings to add to the mix. Moffat's hysterical and ill-informed conservative condemnation of Manson as scapegoat for the counterculture is only slightly more extreme than the approach we find in the ostensible, more respectable Manson tones that followed. In particular, the obscure Satan's Slaves was the first book to aggressively push the misguided theory that the process church of the final judgment was a major influence on Manson's theology. This theme and the dehumanization of Manson was a demonic mind control monster, which Satan's Slaves also traded in, was polished and popularized by Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders, The Family, the story of Charles Manson's Dune Buggy Attack, Battalion 1971, was the story of Charles Manson. Dune Buggy was the first in-depth mass market hardcover book about the Manson case. Released by the legitimate publisher E.F. Dutton, The Family was perceived by the public to be a more reliable source of valid information than the sordid paperback potboilers already on the market. Most appearances were deceiving. The Manson depicted in The Family is a one-dimensional cipher, a villainous cartoon of unmitigated insanity and metaphysical evil. Sanders' portrayal of Manson marked the path that almost all other studies of the case followed. It assured the coverage of the Manson phenomenon would remain stuck in the genre of supernatural horror fiction rather than being seen as a subject deserving a serious inquiry. Sanders' habit of using the phrase OEO every time he tells us something we are supposed to find frightening not only quickly grates on the reader's nerves, this device also sums up the simplistic spookhouse level of which Sanders reduced the tale he tells. Shortly after Manson's influence for murders, Sanders, a hippie rock musician with countercultural credentials and revolutionary pretensions, had written a series of supportive articles in the Los Angeles Times underground press. These tended to lead towards the defendant's innocence. Several Manson loyalists at the Spahn Ranch also trusted Sanders and spoke to him, thinking that the long-haired underground poet was on their side. Manson himself was first fooled by Sanders' apparently unbiased attitude. The Tate LaBianca defense team wrongly assumed that Sanders' book would be a sympathetic portrayal of their clients. The lawyers for the defense had their media allies. They illegally leaked detailed police reports and other court documents when unavailable to the public, but to Sanders. It's clear that he based a great deal of the family directly on the material. Because he had access to those illuminating internal documents, Sanders had the opportunity to tell something much closer to the truth about the crimes than the mass media was presenting. Fortunately, he lacked the courage to follow through the only logical conclusion anyone reading the police reports would have come to. Throughout the family, Sanders repeatedly dropped hints that the crimes must have been related to dope dealing. He also makes his client that Manson's contract to the music industry was far more established than the generally disseminated cover story allowed. In fact, The Family, as early as 1971, was the first book to mention, albeit briefly, such crucial suppressed details as the case of Joel Rostow's delivery of drugs to Cielo Drive and the gold coin stolen from the LaBiancas. Sanders also deserves credit as the first author to insist that Terry Melcher's relationship with Manson was much closer than the media and the trial ever let on. But Sanders inexplicably coy in the way that he introduces these important facts. One would have to deeply be versed in the then inaccurate, inaccessible secret background to the crimes to even begin to understand what he's hinting at in between the lines. As a result, a handful of important clues which Sanders scatters here and there is the same true nature of the Cielo Waverly murders gets less in an incriminating mass of out-of-control context and disinformation of which his strangely opaque text is composed. For every pertinent truth which Sanders makes hurried mention of, there are hundreds of outright fantasies and unfounded rumors to mislead the reader. The family contends that the Manson Circle made snuff films, performed animal sacrifices, and committed dozens of unsolved murders. These uncontrolled claims continued to inform the Manson legend based on a handful of authentic leads to the truth about the Tate LaBianca crimes that Sanders revealed. He might as well have broken the case as he had bothered to pursue them properly when the trail was still hot. Instead, for the reasons that are hard to fathom, he devoted a substantial part of the family to pages of sheer nonsense about Robert de Grimston and the Process Church of the First Judgment and Jean Brayton and her Solar Lodge of the OTO. Several other supposedly sinister but nameless inputs based on no convincing proof are asserted to have been a key importance in influencing Manson's spiritual teaching. As a result, the family could have been a groundbreaking source of valid information in a hell dominated by sensational lies. Because the main culprit responsible for spreading the wrong ideas about Manson's mysticism that remain prevalent to this day. The Process Church mounted a successful lawsuit against Sanders and his publisher, which forced them to publicly retract the family's absurd libels. In the enduring damage this book has done to accurate understanding of the Manson phenomenon remains a principal legacy. Many who fancy themselves to be Manson supporters have drawn their knowledge about their hero from the family, assuming that some reason that Sanders presented the inside story. Although he doesn't make it the center of his work, Sanders further discredits himself by fully supporting the same Beatles helter-skelter race with foolishness which Buzolsi made a core of his later best-selling multimedia creation. The deceptive literary propaganda produced by Atkins, Bugliosi, Watson and Watkins was clearly written for cynical and self-serving reasons and was deliberately intended to deceive. But unlike the other best-known examples of the standard Manson literature, there is no reason to suppose that Sanders was motivated to write The Family as part of the cover-up. Sanders may be the only one of the authors responsible for creating the false Manson myth who really believed in the folly he promulgated. The Family was the only Manson book written by the bohemian advocates of psychedelic drugs who were actually conversant with the counterculture lifestyle. You would not know it from the text itself. The family view Manson through a socially conservative and bourgeois perspective, which even the most reactionary readers of the time could identify with. Sanders' unremittingly hostile depiction of Manson and his circle never seeks to understand. It only gains to frighten and repel. If Sanders' rather incoherent jumble of facts, fantasy, and affected prose style has an agenda, it's to prove that the evil mutant Spawn and Spawn were definitely not a part of his beloved counterculture, but were instead some inhuman anomaly far from the anemic deaths. Three of the jurors, who were more or less fell for Bugliosi's bullshit, chimed in with mediocre memoirs of their experience. The first of these was George Bishop, Witness to Evil, 1971. Bishop observed that he thought Bugliosi believed in Helter Skelter more than anyone else in the courtroom, and otherwise offers the unusual take at the trial. The cover illustration of Manson as a dynamic puppeteer pulling the strings of the disciples sums up the simple-minded myth with more eloquence than the book itself. Witness to Evil does provide a detailed blow-by-blow account of the trial, but the author adds jarring tone and curious writing style, making it an off-putting read, underscoring the counterculture thrust of the book. Art Linkletter, and of the plunging daughter, often a ranting and raving introduction, blaming everything on LSD. The Manson book, reflection of a pseudo-juror, and the William Zamora's trial by your peers round out the subgenre within the genre. Juror Zamora's account was later released under the Guardian epithet of Blood Family, with a blurb promising of all preservation and passion of the weirdest cult members' murders since pagan times. We have already had come to mention the imaginative take on the truth which Manson erstwhile associates texts and sadies offered on their current mixtures of born-again confessionals and true crime thrillers, changing the story to the unpriest time. Atkins was first of the Manson circle to claim the salvation of the Lord, allowed her life to be reduced to the pious ghost-written potboiler, child of Satan, child of God, 1977. Chaplain Ray Hoekstra's authored texts equally untruthful as told his pseudo-autobiography, Will You Die For Me, in 1978. The preachy sectarian sermonizing that dominates both books and their publication by small Christian firms assured that they found limited readership. They added relatively little to the already firmly established Manson myth, but sales and distribution were the last of Tex and Sadie's ambitions at this point in their lives. The satanic portrait of Manson provided in these stray lambs accounts were primarily designed to convince the parole board that it was all their ex-guru's fault, that they had their now repented. The only good review Tex and Sadie were interested in was a date with their release. This doesn't mean that they're not eminently worth reading for the genuinely relevant information they both reveal, so long as they take everything with gruesome, twosome claim with a pillar of salt the size of Lot's wife when she looked back at Sodom. In 1979, little Paul Watkins and Guillermo Soledad produced My Life with Charles Manson, the most credible of the various eyewitness accounts written by Manson intimates. Watkins' memoirs different from other chronicles in that at least presents Manson as a fully drawn human being rather than a strange character. Watkins also offers a far more accurate and subtle exegesis of Manson's teachings when he slanted versions offered by other books of this type. The general sympathetic take on Manson found in at least half of Watkins' revived account of life on the ranch seems widely out of joint with the negative picture provided in the other half. The reasons for the external dissonance is due to the fact that Watson had added several sections of the manuscript in order to accord with the false testimony to give in court on behalf of the prosecution. I think we're going to stop here now because it's going to go into the Beatles and Helter Skelter, and that's just more stuff for the vinyl community and the crime community to figure out. And I've read it, but I need to reread it and still keep trying to learn it about all this false information between Sanders and the guys who wrote helter skelter for Bugliosi, and the end of Sharon Tate. So we thank all the vinyl communities and the members. And if you enjoy my stream, like and subscribe.